Hello and welcome to Noteworthy Reading, where we're in part 3 of our Tolkien series in an episode entitled Holes in the Ground, where we are going to talk about Tolkien's actual experience in World War I, his friends who survived the war and who didn't survive the war, and the mindset that Tolkien was in when he was exiting the war, which would eventually lead up to his writing of Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion and all the great books that he authored. So we're glad you're here, and we'll get started. So we left off last time with Tolkien's poem that he wrote right before he left to go to France, entitled The Lonely Isle. And that's where he bids farewell to Edith, his wife, whom he had just married. He bids farewell to England, where he grew up, and he's not too optimistic going into that conflict. And before you are too hard on Tolkien and are wondering, why can't he be a little bit less gloomy, and why isn't he excited to go off to war and all of that, you have to understand that conflict was uniquely awful. Between 1914 and 1918, some 9 million soldiers would die, if you account for all sides, and 38 million would be wounded. So somewhere in the ballpark of 46 million casualties are taken in that war. And if you break it down like this, in a war that lasted 1,566 days, you have upwards of 6,000 soldiers dying every day. That's a level of casualties that is really difficult for us to fathom. In Afghanistan, we lost upwards of 2,000 soldiers, so over a 20-year period. So that World War I conflict really marred that generation. I think 1 in 8 soldiers who went and fought would die. That's an incredible level of casualties. Also, and the reason for that is because there's lots of new weapons and munitions and tactics that are introduced, and it really turned into a situation where you had standoffs. You had trenches, a lot of people on each side dug in, and just shelling and machine gun fire. And they also used mustard gas, which if you it would blister your skin, and breathing it in would irritate your lungs. They use chlorine gas, which people would die of asphyxiation. Particularly in the Battle of Marne in France, you could really see how artillery was shaping the war. They fired over the course of 5 days. They fired 432,000 shells. Okay, and they could basically cover in 50 seconds, they could cover an area of 10 acres. And they could just sweep that area with artillery. So when you gather a lot of people in one place and you have that kind of firepower, it leads to digging in and mass casualties. And that's part of why World War I is thought to be just one of the most awful circumstances that we've had really in the 21st century. If you want a really good book on how J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's experiences in the war sort of shaped their early adulthood, you should pick up Joseph Loconte's The Hobbit Wardrobe and A Great War. It's extremely good. He's very thorough in his explanation of why the war happened, and particularly what their day-to-day life was like in the war. You should pick it up. So before we really talk about Tolkien's daily experience in the war and what his role was like, we'll do just a little brief synopsis on sort of why did World War I happen. We're not going to do an exhaustive explanation of that. If you want one, you should listen to Dan Carlton's Hardcore History. He has a whole series on World War I, and it's fantastic. His descriptions and his level of detail, and I think just his ability to wrap his mind around what that entire conflict was like, it's excellent. You should listen to it. So, why did World War I happen? Basically, there were a number of alliances that surrounded the Ottoman Empire. And what it meant was you have, mighty powerful Russia, France and Britain allied, and then you have Germany Austria and Hungary, and they're sort of trying to form their own sort of power axis. And when the Austrian Duke and his wife were killed on June 28th, 1914, that was viewed as an act of war. The German Kaiser declares war, and all of the other powers that are allied basically declare war on each other. So Russia, Germany, France, they're now at war with Germany, Austria, Hungary, and all the other parties that are involved. So it's the first really global conflict that, all these countries are connected and fighting each other. So that's generally why it occurred, and Germany kind of had a carte blanche. They kind of wrote Austria and Hungary a blank check. They just said, you know what, if these people go to war with you, we're going to go to war with them. And there was no other sort of political safeguards to prevent that from happening. So what was Tolkien's role in the war? Like we mentioned before, Tolkien trained with the Lancashire Fusiliers, which was an infantry unit, and he was a signal officer within that infantry unit. So he's going to be solving problems with telegram wire. He's going to be trying to send runners to get things communicated on where people are and what movements need to happen on the battlefield. There's still a monument in the Manchester area outside the Gallipoli Gardens Museum, and it's a monument to the Lancashire Fusiliers. I think that'd be fun to visit one day. So Tolkien, he leaves England. He arrives in France about 4 weeks before the Battle of the Somme. Okay, and he was with about 800 men, and they were stationed along the river in northern France, the Somme River in northern France. They arrived by train. They ate a meal at a field kitchen, and Tolkien marched up the road where he saw orchards, cornfields, poppies that were blooming blue and red. So it's not really like the season is in sympathy with the battle. It's actually a very beautiful springtime. But eventually it did start raining. The roads got really muddy. They're moving these heavy artillery pieces, lots of heavy munitions on these roads, and you have to understand the infrastructure back then wasn't really made to handle, first of all, all the traffic, the weight that those roads were bearing, and also the rain just really did it in. So this beautiful spring turns into this muddy mess where you have all these men who are gearing up to get ready to fight. So Tolkien, along with 4 other officers, were serving under Colonel Godfrey Bird, and they were joined by the Royal Irish Rifles, who was an infantry unit to sort of bolster their numbers there. A lot of the men that Tolkien was stationed with were veterans of the Boer War, and he wasn't too impressed with them. One of the things that he said is that the most improper job of any man is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. So you get the idea that, being stationed with all these guys who were, telling each other what to do, and it wasn't really his thing. He was a good lieutenant, he was a good leader, but he wasn't best friends with many of the other leaders that he was with. Tolkien's friend Rob Gilson was actually stationed nearby, and he recalls also seeing the flowers and the poppies that were kind of tangled and growing everywhere, and the gardens that the communities had. But he also noted that he could see the artillery fire in the distance, and he said that actually it had the grandeur of thunderstorms. You could see the flashes, you could hear these booms, and he said it would have been beautiful if it wasn't so terrible. But he was near Tolkien. They were both around Buzencourt, which was about 3 miles away from the front line, and that's where Tolkien first came under German shelling. He and his company he was stationed with, they would shelter in cellars and houses and huts because they were constantly being barraged. They could look over on the horizon, they could see the German balloons that were hovering over the trenches, because that's where the forward observers would actually look and see where the enemy movements were and where it would be a good place to shell. So, Tolkien's stationed in Buzencourt, and why is there this big conflict there? Well, the Germans had occupied a hill. It was called the Height of Olivers, and it was just a chalky white ridge, but it gave them the high ground so they could see, have a better view, and be more difficult to overtake by any advancing force. So, on July 1st, 1916, that was the first day of battle there. Over 20,000 Allied soldiers died, 35,000 were wounded. So a very, very intense conflict that Tolkien witnessed. On July 14th, in the spirit of the Allies' Bastille Day, because you got to remember this is France, the British planned an advance of 22,000 troops, and a lot of their movement was done at night. So you have in the dark, you have all this traffic, all these horses and men trying to maneuver. But in the end, they would end up taking about 57,000 casualties. And you kind of have to wonder if they were just hoping that the Germans would run out of ammunition. But eventually they would take that hill, but at great loss. And you could, even if you just look at the German preparation, if you look at the Allies' trenches and you look at the Germans' trenches, the Germans had wooden planks, they had ladders. Deep dugouts. Their engineering and their preparation was much better, and even with the constant shelling, it almost looked like there was barely a dent in some places. So, and that couldn't be said for the French and British trenches. They just weren't as well made, so they took a lot more casualties. One soldier, Robert Graves, described the quote soul-deadening trenches as a nauseating place where mud, rain, lice, fleas, spoiled food, rotting corpses, packs of rats as big as cats, and swarms of flies eating dead things, marred a battlefield where men died every minute as steel rain rained down on their heads. It was a place of brutality and terror that broke the psyche of many men who returned from this front with uncontrollable shakes and night terrors. We now know, this is PTSD, but they also had, because of all the concussive blast and the constant shelling, they experienced kind of this new phenomenon of shell shock. They would actually have men who were standing. They looked like they were fine, but they would just be still, almost in like an epileptic state. And some of them were actually just standing there, and they hadn't died yet. But there's actually video of this. If you look on YouTube and you just YouTube shell shock, World War I shell shock, you'll see people with uncontrollable shaking, and they think that all the blasts affected people's nervous systems, so that they couldn't control their bodies as well. Authors like Wilfred Owen recalls, just the monstrous anger of the guns. Henry Williams recalls how one wave of men would merge into the first and second wave, as some wave gave to terror while others slowly bowed and rolled over dead. Ernest Hemingway said of World War I, World War I was the most colossal, murderous, mismanaged butchery that has ever taken place on Earth. Any writer who said otherwise lied. So the writers either wrote propaganda, shut up, or fought. So pretty awful memories of that whole situation. So that's a brief picture of what Tolkien's life was like during that 5 months. He had memorized call signs. He avoided using flags because that attracted attention. They couldn't use a lot of manual signals from that were visible, because obviously that would be seen and they'd be fired upon. But he eventually developed symptoms of the influenza, the trench fever, that was started in World War I. And if you count Spanish influenza deaths over time, World War I is still the most mass casualty event that we've ever seen. And there was a lot of people who would look down if you try to cry off sick. I mean, this wasn't. You have to understand, this wasn't Tolkien trying to get out of anything. He was transferred to a hospital on October 28th, 1916, and they confirmed that he had contracted trench fever. It probably saved his life. They tried to rehabilitate him a few times and get him back on his feet and strong enough to go back, but eventually the doctors just said, he's got to heal up before he's going to be able to go back. And by the time he got better. The war was over. So, in a way, his sickness probably saved him. But sadly, not all of his friends survived. Many of his friends, T.K. Barnsley, G.B. Smith, Rob Gilson, and other schoolmates, they died. Many of them in the Battle of the Somme, where eventually there were 300,000 casualties all in all in the Battle of the Somme. Half a century later, Tolkien would reflect on this, I guess the losses of his friends in the war, and he wrote, all but one of my close friends were dead, and I think he meant Christopher Wiseman. So I think it's interesting that he could be later in life and still say, all those relationships that he formed growing up, all the people that he bonded with in the TCVS and at King Edward's still meant a great deal to him, and he missed them very much. So on the morning of July 1st, 1916, Tolkien's good friend, Rob Gilson, was about 1,000 meters away from the German line, and the British had just been pounding that line constantly, and it was hard to believe that anything over there that they had just shelled could still have survived. But as we mentioned before, those German trenches were very well made, and they were a lot more prepared for that sort of artillery war than the British and the French. But at around 7, Germans start counter-firing. They fire these massive, 2-gallon drum-sized shells over their head, and there's machine gun rounds zipping overhead. And at 7:20, Gilson, checks his watch. He readies his men. He spreads them over about 100 yards of line of their trench. And then at 7:30, he whistles them up the ladders, and they start charging. There was a captain who was wounded, who was with Gilson's charge, and he was wounded 10 minutes in, and he said he recalled that he saw the lieutenant still charging across. At about 9 a.m., they had moved 200 yards, so past the German front line, and then Gilson's major was hit. Gilson gives verbal command. He puts Gilson in command to keep going. And I guess the last we know is that Gilson's sergeant major was hit, and one of the soldiers came crawling back and said that Gilson had passed away. So Tolkien's friend died that morning. One poem that not Gilson, but G.B. Smith wrote, sort of in memory of his friends, or sort of wishing that they could all be together again in the midst of this grand conflict, goes like this. He says, "Let us tell quiet stories of kind eyes and placid brows, where peace and learning state, of misty gardens under evening skies, where four would walk of old, with steps sedate. Let's have no word of all the sweat and blood, of all the noise and strife and dust and smoke, we who have seen death surging like a flood, wave upon wave, that leapt and raced and broke. Or let's sit quietly, we three together, around a wide hearth fire that's glowing red, giving no thought to all the stormy weather that flies above the roof over tree overhead. And he, the fourth that lies all silently, in some far distant and untended grave, under the shadow of a shattered tree, shall leave the company of the hapless brave, and draw nigh unto us for memory's sake, because a look, a word, a deed, a friend, are bound with cords that never a man may break, unto his heart forever until the end." So this fourth that Smith is referencing is Gilson. This was his mourning of his friend's death. G.B. Smith, who authored that poem, he actually died while serving with the Salford Pals 9 miles north of Bouzencourt. He was helping drain roads in freezing rain and snow, and it actually organized a football match to happen later on in the day, but he was hit by a howitzer round that was fired 4 miles away, and he smoked a cigarette at the aid station, said he was fine, and he died 2 days later of infection. So that was the second of Tolkien's friends to die. Tolkien didn't know about his friend's death immediately, but he did find out in a letter from Chris Wiseman about Smith's death. Wiseman wrote to him and said he couldn't really say much about it, but he hoped that Almighty God would be worthy of their friend, which I think there's that sounds pretty calloused at that point. I guess Wiseman was probably struggling, having seen that whole generation was struggling, wondering why all this was happening to them. They've been taught all these virtues. They've been brought up to be to lead, and now there's just all this killing and all this death and war. So you can kind of see a touch of callousness in Wiseman in the way that he states that. And something else that Chris Wiseman actually wrote to Tolkien, and this is really about, he's reflecting on the death of his friends, and he's realizing that they hadn't been saved. Their group had not been saved. And he writes Tolkien, and he says, what is not done is left undone, and love that is avoided becomes strangely like mockery. He's writing this sort of wishing that his friends could still live the lives that he knew they wanted to live. You can very much see that in Wiseman. Looking back on the war, Tolkien remarked that the utter stupid waste of the war didn't justify pacifism or unwillingness to protect what is good. About actually going to fight and protect your country and the things that you believe in, he said it will be necessary to face it in an evil world. So Tolkien didn't really exit the war as a pacifist or with too much cynicism like much of his generation. You can also see this attitude that Tolkien had exiting the war in his character Galadriel, when she says, "Through the ages of the world we have fought the long defeat," meaning that even though you think you won't win, it doesn't mean that you have the right to give up. I think that's a grace that's lost on a lot of people these days. Another character that you can kind of see Tolkien's sentiment about war, who expresses Tolkien's sentiment about war, is Captain Faramir, when he says, "War must be while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all. But I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they protect." That's from Tolkien in The Two Towers. That's the mindset that Tolkien had after World War I. He also, he lost a lot of his friends. His friend T.K. Barnsley died. He and Chris Wiseman were the only ones who really survived that he was close to. The influenza saved his life. It was an awful experience, but upon leaving the conflict, he still believed that it's good to defend the things that you believe in. And unlike many of his generation, he wasn't so damaged by the whole conflict that he couldn't bring himself to believe that there is a good God, and that you do have to fight evil when you see it. So that's where we're going to leave off. We hope to return to Tolkien later. We thank you for joining us for this series.